The first sign that the strangers underestimated humanity was not the fleet that slid out of the void, with the confidence of a species that had never been contradicted by extinction. It was the message they sent ahead of themselves, a careful lattice of symbols and measured tones that assumed the universe sorted itself naturally into rulers and resources. The transmission arrived at the outer listening posts of the Perseus Reach and unspooled across arrays that had been built by people who expected to be wrong and planned accordingly. The message announced ownership of the system, listed the biological inefficiencies of the local primates, and offered a timetable for compliance that read like a weather report. It was calm, precise, and utterly certain that resistance was a theoretical exercise best reserved for inferior minds. On Karan Station, a scaffold of habitats and shipyards bolted together by 3 generations of incremental necessity, the message was heard by a technician named Marable Quonset, who had been awake too long and had learned, as most station-born humans did, to distrust calm precision. She listened to the harmonics of the signal, noticed the way it corrected itself for anticipated errors, and flagged it not because it threatened, but because it presumed. Presumption was how airlocks failed and reactors went critical. Presumption was how people died. She sent the alert up the chain without commentary, because commentary slowed things down, and leaned back in her chair to stretch muscles that had adapted to low gravity by becoming stubbornly resistant to comfort. The response that followed did not take the form the strangers expected. There was no immediate counterclaim, no chest-beating declaration of sovereignty, no attempt to negotiate from a position of weakness or bluster. Instead, there was a silence that was not empty but busy, a silence full of people arguing, calculating, and remembering every story they had told themselves about how the universe worked. Humanity had been alone for a long time, long enough to build myths about first contact that alternated between hope and terror. Those myths had not prepared them for the banality of conquest offered as an administrative update. Admiral Tamsin Rourke had been born on a planet with too much wind and learned early that survival favored those who leaned into pressure rather than braced against it. She stood in the command gallery of Karan Station with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the playback of the message without expression. Her face was a map of lines earned by making decisions that would never be universally praised, and her eyes were sharp in the way of people who had learned to see patterns where others saw noise. Around her, officers and analysts waited, each carrying their own version of the moment when everything changed. "They think we are static," she said finally, not to anyone in particular. "They think we have a center they can decapitate and edges they can harvest. They think biology dictates destiny." No one disagreed, because disagreement would have required optimism, and optimism was not a policy. The strangers, who called themselves something that translated loosely to stewards of order, had a history written in the ruins of other species. Their fleets were modular, their soldiers bred for compliance and durability, their technology elegant and cruel in its efficiency. They had encountered resistance before and recorded it the way a naturalist recorded storms, as phenomena to be endured and outlasted. They had never encountered humans. The decision to respond did not come from a single mind or a single room. It emerged from a network of councils, committees, and informal back channels that humanity had evolved precisely because no one trusted anyone else to get it right alone. There were arguments that burned hot and fast, and others that smoldered for days. There were voices that urged surrender as a means of survival, and others that demanded defiance as a matter of identity. In the end, what tipped the balance was not pride, but curiosity, a deeply human need to poke at assumptions and see what broke. The reply was sent from a relay boy at the edge of the system, encoded in a way that invited translation rather than enforced it. It acknowledged receipt, rejected the premise of ownership, and requested clarification on the biological inefficiencies cited. It did not threaten, it did not plead, it asked questions. The stewards of order responded with confusion that bordered on irritation. Questions were not part of the script. They clarified, listing metrics and comparisons, explaining how human musculoskeletal systems wasted energy, how neural plasticity led to unpredictability, how emotional bonding interfered with optimal decision-making. They spoke as though reciting a syllabus to inattentive students. Humanity listened, and somewhere between the third and fourth exchange, someone laughed. It was not a dismissive laugh, but one of recognition, the sound people made when they realized they had been misjudged in a familiar way. For centuries, humans had been told by their own experts that they were inefficient, that evolution was a series of compromises, that the body was a kludge and the mind a patchwork. They had survived by embracing those flaws and turning them into tools. The first engagement did not happen in space. It happened in a laboratory buried under kilometers of regolith on a moon that had no name worth translating. There, a team led by a xenobiologist named Havelock Irii examined fragments of alien material retrieved by a probe that had slipped past the outer patrols of the stewards. The material was grown rather than built, lattices of living crystal that conducted energy and information with equal grace. It was beautiful, and it was brittle in ways that mattered. They optimize for the average case, Irii said, running a gloved finger along a fracture that had propagated exactly as predicted. They assume conditions fall within expected ranges. We do not. That observation rippled outward, informing tactics and strategies that favored chaos over control. Human ships were retrofitted not to match the elegance of the stewards, but to confound their senses. Hulls were scarred intentionally, profiles altered mid-flight, heat signatures spiked and dropped in patterns that defied classification. Crews were trained to operate without centralized command, to improvise when cut off, to trust in each other rather than in systems that could be disrupted. When the stewards finally arrived in force, their fleet blotting out stars with geometric precision, they found a system that refused to behave. Defensive platforms appeared where none had been detected, powered by reactors that burned dirty and loud. Civilian traffic scattered not in predictable evacuation corridors, but in swarms that mimicked debris fields. Communication channels filled with overlapping signals that were not jamming so much as conversation. A babble of human voices arguing, coordinating, and sharing bad jokes under fire. The battle over Karan Station lasted less than an hour by the clocks of the stewards and felt like a lifetime to the people inside. Admiral Rourke watched as human ships darted and weaved, taking hits that should have crippled them and continuing on sheer stubbornness. She watched as a freighter piloted by a family that had been hauling ice for decades rammed an alien cruiser after its engines failed, turning mass into a weapon with the inevitability of physics. She watched as a boarding action led by a security chief named Oleg Perds turned into a close-quarters fight where human adaptability trumped engineered strength. The stewards retreated, not because they had been defeated in the conventional sense, but because their models had broken. Losses that should have been acceptable thresholds cascaded into unacceptable uncertainty. They withdrew to reassess, to recalibrate, to understand what had gone wrong. On Karan Station, fires were put out, hull breaches sealed, and the dead mourned with a pragmatism born of necessity. There was no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement that the universe had changed. Humanity had announced itself not as a subject to be managed, but as a variable that refused to be constrained. In the aftermath, Admiral Rourke addressed the station with a message that was brief and unadorned. She spoke of the cost and the likelihood that this was only the beginning. She spoke of the need to learn faster than their opponents and to accept that survival would demand sacrifices that could not be evenly distributed. She did not speak of destiny or manifest right. She spoke of work. As the stewards regrouped beyond the heliopause, their analysts struggled with data that refused to settle. They had encountered species that fought fiercely and died quickly, species that capitulated and were absorbed, species that fractured and became footnotes. Humanity fit none of those categories. Humanity adapted in real time, learned from failure, and leveraged qualities that the stewards had long ago pruned from themselves in the pursuit of order. The war that would follow would not be decided by a single battle or a single brilliant mind. It would be shaped by countless moments like the one Marable Quonset experienced when she flagged a message because it presumed too much, by the laughter that greeted a list of supposed flaws, by the choice to ask questions instead of issuing threats. It would be a war fought under unfamiliar suns, with weapons forged from curiosity and defiance, and it would begin not with a roar, but with the quiet realization that being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. The stewards of order did not retreat far. They did not believe in distance as a solution, only in perspective. Their fleets reassembled beyond the sensor fog of the outer system, vessels locking into formations that reflected centuries of doctrine refined against predictable adversaries. Within their command structures, debate was minimal because debate implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was treated as a flaw to be corrected rather than a condition to be explored. What they discussed instead were parameters. Human resistance was reclassified from negligible to anomalous, a bureaucratic adjustment that carried the quiet weight of many previous extinctions. An anomaly was not an equal, but it was something that required attention. They dispatched observers rather than conquerors at first, ships designed not to dominate space, but to watch it. These vessels were thin and angular, grown around sensory nodes that drank in radiation, gravity fluctuations, and electromagnetic noise. They hovered at the edges of human territory, mapping movement patterns and response times, cataloging how quickly damaged infrastructure was repaired and how often civilian assets were repurposed for military use. The stewards noted, with something approaching disapproval, that humans blurred categories with alarming frequency. Lines between combatant and non-combatant, between supply and weapon, between order and improvisation were porous to the point of meaninglessness. On the human side, the lull was not mistaken for peace. Reconstruction happened at the same time as preparation, because there was no luxury of sequence. Karan Station became a crucible of overlapping efforts, shipwrights working alongside medics, engineers arguing with philosophers, children doing homework in corridors that still smelled faintly of scorched insulation. Admiral Rourke moved through it all like a constant, listening more than she spoke, collecting fragments of insight from places that formal channels never reached. One such fragment came from a maintenance bay where a propulsion specialist named Anselma Rhee was testing a prototype drive that deliberately violated safety margins. Rhee had grown up on a mining habitat where rules were guidelines until they killed someone, and she had internalized a relationship with machinery that was almost conversational. When Rourke asked what she was doing, Rhee explained without stopping her work that the stewards' pursuit algorithms assumed ships would avoid self-damage at all costs. By building drives that could be overclocked into partial failure, humans could create bursts of acceleration that looked impossible on paper and therefore went unpredicted in simulation. "They think we love our ships more than our objectives," Rhee said, wiping grease from her hands. "They think we stop when alarms go off. We do not." That philosophy extended beyond hardware. Training regimens shifted away from rote drills and toward scenario saturation. Crews were exposed to conflicting orders, incomplete data, and simulated equipment failures designed to overwhelm decision-making frameworks. The goal was not to eliminate stress, but to normalize it, to make chaos a familiar companion rather than a paralyzing surprise. Psychologists embedded with fleet units observed that humans performed best not when calm, but when engaged, emotions sharpened rather than suppressed. Meanwhile, Havelock Irii and his team continued to dissect the biology of the steward's technology. They discovered that the living crystal lattices were optimized for stability, self-healing, along predefined pathways that resisted mutation. When subjected to novel stimuli, however, the material did not adapt so much as it rejected, isolating damaged sections and sacrificing them to preserve the whole. It was an elegant solution for predictable environments and a liability in the face of creative interference. Using this knowledge, human engineers developed munitions that did not aim to destroy, but to confuse. These devices introduced noise into alien systems, forcing them into constant self-correction loops that drained power and processing capacity. It was the technological equivalent of asking too many questions at once, and it worked because the stewards' systems were built to answer one question perfectly rather than many questions adequately. The second engagement occurred near a gas giant whose storms had names given by bored cartographers. The stewards advanced with a measured confidence, deploying ships in layered formations that had broken countless defenses before. Human forces met them not with a line, but with a cloud, ships appearing and disappearing within the planet's radiation belts, using natural phenomena as cover rather than obstacles. The battle unfolded not as a clash, but as a series of misalignments, stewards' weapons firing where targets had been and human strikes landing where defenses had not been allocated. In one skirmish, a corvette captained by Javed Malenko lost its primary sensor array to an early hit and continued the fight by triangulating enemy positions through secondary reflections and gut instinct. Malenko had once been a street racer on a drowned world, navigating by echoes and intuition when formal maps failed. His ship weaved through enemy fire, delivering payloads that forced a larger alien vessel to withdraw, its systems overloaded by conflicting data. The stewards recorded these encounters with increasing concern. Their analysts began to identify a pattern not in human tactics, but in human thinking. Humans did not seek to eliminate uncertainty, they exploited it. Where other species had attempted to match the stewards, order with order of their own, humans introduced variables faster than they could be categorized. It was not strength or numbers that posed the greatest threat, but adaptability expressed at every level of engagement. In response, the stewards escalated. They deployed ground forces to a marginal colony, a settlement built into the ice of a moon whose subsurface ocean had promised resources worth the risk. The assault was swift, and surgical alien soldiers descending in controlled vectors, securing key infrastructure with minimal collateral damage. They broadcast a message offering protection in exchange for compliance, a calculated demonstration meant to show the benefits of acquiescence. The humans on the ground did not comply. They did not mount a conventional defense either. Instead, they sabotaged their own facilities, flooding tunnels and collapsing access shafts, turning the environment into a weapon. Miners and researchers, people who had never held a rifle, coordinated through ad hoc networks to mislead occupying forces, drawing them into dead ends and pressure traps. A botanist named Celeste Navarro used genetically modified algae to clog alien filtration systems, exploiting differences in atmospheric processing that no military planner had considered relevant. When a human relief force arrived days later, they found the stewards entrenched but strained, their soldiers exhausted by constant low-level disruptions that never rose to the level of formal engagement. The counterattack was brutal and brief. The stewards withdrew, leaving behind equipment that self-destructed rather than be captured, a gesture that spoke of frustration as much as doctrine. News of the moon spread through human space not as propaganda, but as instruction. Communities far from the front lines began to plan for occupations they hoped would never come, mapping their own vulnerabilities and inventing ways to turn them into strengths. Farmers discussed soil chemistry as a means of interference. Programmers wrote code designed to fail interestingly. Artists contributed by visualizing data in ways that revealed patterns traditional graphs missed. The war effort became a cultural project as much as a military one. Admiral Rourke convened a council that included not only officers, but civilians drawn from disparate fields. In the circular chamber overlooking the curve of a planet, they argued fiercely about priorities and ethics. There were limits, lines that some insisted should not be crossed even in the face of existential threat. Others countered that survival demanded flexibility not only in tactics but in values. Rourke listened, intervening only to remind them that the stewards were not waiting for consensus. In the end, they agreed on a principle rather than a plan. Humanity would remain unpredictable even to itself. Centralization would be resisted. Redundancy would be embraced. Failure would be treated as data rather than disgrace. It was not a comforting doctrine, but it was an honest one. As the stewards prepared their next move, their internal models strained under the weight of too many exceptions. They began to question assumptions that had guided them for generations, a dangerous process for a society built on the premise that perfection was achievable. Some within their ranks argued for annihilation as the simplest solution, others for withdrawal to avoid contamination by human chaos. The fact that such arguments occurred at all was unprecedented. Under unfamiliar suns, humanity dug in not by building walls, but by sharpening edges. They learned faster because they had to, because they always had. The war was no longer about territory or resources. It was about whether a species that thrived on imperfection could survive contact with one that worshipped order, and whether the universe had room for both. The stewards of order convened their first internal tribunal in recorded history 3 rotations after the loss of the ice moon. It was not called a tribunal in their language, because that word implied judgment rather than calibration, but the function was the same. Senior coordinators, genetic architects, and predictive theorists gathered within a sphere of living crystal that adjusted its acoustics to ensure perfect audibility. The agenda was singular. Humanity could no longer be treated as an anomaly to be smoothed away. Humanity was exerting pressure on the foundations of steward doctrine, and pressure demanded response. The opening assessment was blunt. Human behavior violated optimization theory. Their willingness to accept self-inflicted damage for situational advantage, their tolerance for decentralized authority, and their apparent emotional reinforcement under stress all contradicted the assumptions embedded in steward biology and machine symbiosis. The theorists presented projections that diverged wildly depending on initial conditions, a level of uncertainty that made long-term planning unreliable. Some argued that this alone justified escalation to total eradication, a return to methods reserved for runaway ecologies that threatened galactic stability. Others hesitated, not out of compassion, but caution. Humanity's influence was already spreading beyond direct engagement. Species on the periphery, long managed by the stewards through careful constraint, had begun to alter their own behaviors after observing human resistance. Trade patterns shifted. Communication networks grew noisier. Small acts of defiance, once rare, increased in frequency. Chaos, the very condition the stewards had spent millennia suppressing, was becoming contagious. The tribunal ended without consensus, which was itself a rupture. In the absence of unanimity, authority deferred to action. A new directive was issued: isolate humanity, cut them off from external influence. Contain the spread of their methods, even if their physical territory could not yet be fully subjugated. It was a defensive posture masquerading as strategic patience. Humanity felt the effects within weeks. Long-range probes went missing. Neutral systems that had previously traded freely with human settlements began to close their ports under steward pressure. Information from beyond the immediate war zone thinned, replaced by silence that was not empty but imposed. For a species that had learned to survive by connecting disparate pieces of knowledge, isolation was a blade aimed at the heart. Admiral Tamsin Rourke recognized the danger immediately. In a briefing attended by fleet commanders and civilian liaisons, she spoke not of battles, but of narratives. "They want us small," she said, "not in size, but in scope. They want us to forget how to learn from others, how to steal good ideas and improve them. We cannot let them define the edges of our thinking." Her solution was not to punch through the isolation, but to leak around it. Human explorers and smugglers, people already accustomed to operating beyond formal oversight, were given quiet support to establish contact with peripheral species. They carried not weapons, but stories, records of how humans fought and adapted, how they failed and recovered. They did not promise victory or protection. They offered examples. One such envoy was a linguist named Parvati Sankara, who had spent her career unraveling dead languages for academic satisfaction before the war gave her work teeth. She traveled aboard a patched-together courier ship to a system inhabited by an amphibious species whose cities floated in layered oceans. The stewards had designated them compliant, useful for bioengineering research, and nothing more. Parvati met with their elders in chambers filled with filtered light and explained, with careful humility, how humans had learned to weaponize unpredictability. She listened in return as they described their own suppressed traditions of improvisation, rituals abandoned generations ago under steward guidance. When she left, she carried with her not an alliance, but a spark. On the front lines, the war grew stranger. The stewards deployed adaptive countermeasures, ships whose internal structures could reconfigure in response to damage, soldiers whose neural pathways were tweaked mid-conflict to reduce hesitation. These innovations closed gaps that humans had exploited before, forcing new approaches. In one engagement near a binary star, human forces found their usual sensor confusion tactics less effective, as alien systems learned to ignore noise patterns and focus on mass and momentum. The response came not from a central command, but from a mid-level officer named Isandro Velez, whose background in disaster response had taught him that when systems hardened, environments could still be manipulated. He ordered his ships to fire not at the stewards directly, but at the space around them, detonating charges that altered local gravitational gradients. The resulting distortions disrupted the finely tuned balance of the adaptive vessels, causing reconfigurations to lag behind reality. It was messy and imprecise, and it worked. As the stewards adjusted again, the cycle accelerated. Each side learned from the other, but the learning was asymmetric. Humans incorporated alien innovations by layering them onto existing diversity, while the stewards attempted to integrate human chaos into a framework that resisted it. The result was a growing internal tension within steward society. Genetic architects reported increased instability among modified soldiers. Predictive models required constant revision, undermining confidence in long-held doctrines. On Earth, which had become more symbol than strategic asset, the war was experienced through delayed feeds and personal messages. Cities continued to function, children went to school, markets rose and fell, but an undercurrent of alertness permeated daily life. People argued in cafes about the ethics of contagion, about whether spreading human methods was a form of cultural violence. Others argued that survival excused everything. The debates were loud, messy, and unresolved, and in that unresolved state, they mirrored the very qualities that kept humanity alive. Havelock Iriai published a paper during this period that circulated far beyond academic circles. In it, he argued that the conflict was not between species, but between philosophies of complexity. The stewards sought to minimize variance, to compress reality into manageable shapes. Humans, by contrast, thrived on excess variance, using it as a reservoir of potential. Attempts by the stewards to absorb human behavior without embracing its underlying acceptance of failure would, Erie predicted, lead to systemic collapse. The stewards intercepted the paper and classified it as psychological warfare. That classification did not prevent it from being discussed within their own ranks. Some younger coordinators found the arguments unsettlingly persuasive. They had grown up in a society where deviation was corrected before it could mature, and yet here was evidence that deviation could be a strength. Quietly, cautiously, they began to experiment at the margins, allowing minor inefficiencies to persist, tolerating small uncertainties to see what emerged. These internal shifts did not go unnoticed. Admiral Rourke received fragmented intelligence suggesting fractures within steward command. She resisted the urge to exploit them directly, aware that pushing too hard could provoke a backlash that unified their opponent. Instead, she authorized operations that emphasized endurance over victory, dragging out engagements to force the stewards to confront their own limitations repeatedly. One such operation involved a convoy escort through a region saturated with micrometeoroids. The stewards attacked with overwhelming force, confident that human ships would either scatter or be destroyed by environmental hazards. Instead, the convoy tightened formation, using shared shielding and coordinated thrusts to navigate the storm. Losses were heavy, but the convoy made it through, and the battle footage circulated widely. Among humans, it reinforced the narrative that cooperation under stress mattered more than individual perfection. Among the stewards, it raised uncomfortable questions about why a formation that should have failed had held. As months turned into years, the war settled into a pattern of constant adaptation. There were no decisive victories, only shifts in momentum that demanded vigilance. Humanity paid dearly for its defiance, entire colonies lost, billions displaced, scars etched into planets and psyches alike. Yet even in loss, humans learned, and that learning fed back into the system. In a quiet moment aboard Karen Station, Admiral Rourke stood before a viewport watching repair drones stitch metal back together. She was joined by Maribel Quonset, the technician whose initial flag had started everything, now promoted beyond anything she had once imagined. They spoke not of strategy, but of exhaustion, of the strange intimacy that came from living under constant threat. "They still do not understand us," Maribel said. "Not really," Rourke nodded, "and we do not fully understand what we are becoming." That may be the cost. Beyond the glass, unfamiliar suns burned with indifferent light. The war had stripped away illusions of simplicity on both sides, revealing a universe that did not reward order or chaos alone, but the uneasy dance between them. Humanity continued that dance not because it was noble or chosen, but because it was the only way they knew how to survive. The fourth year of the war began without ceremony, marked only by a subtle change in how the stewards of order moved. Where once their fleets advanced with rigid symmetry, they now displayed irregularities that human analysts struggled to interpret. Ships arrived out of expected sequence. Engagements were initiated and aborted without clear cause. It was not randomness, but it was no longer the clean expression of doctrine that had defined steward action since first contact. Something within them was shifting, and like any large organism under strain, the change manifested first as inconsistency. Human intelligence networks, already stretched thin by isolation, worked obsessively to understand these deviations. On Karen Station, teams pored over sensor data, searching for patterns that might reveal intent. Some argued that the stewards were learning, finally embracing a form of adaptability that could negate humanity's core advantage. Others suggested the opposite, that internal disagreement was fracturing their command cohesion. Admiral Tamsin Rourke listened to both camps and allowed neither to dominate planning. Certainty, she had learned, was more dangerous than ignorance. The truth, as it often did, lay in the uncomfortable space between. Within steward society, the long-suppressed tolerance for variance had begun to express itself not as creative flourishing, but as stress. Genetic modifications layered over generations had optimized their kind for obedience to predictive structures. Now those structures were failing, and the biological systems built to rely on them reacted poorly. Coordination delays increased. Individual units made decisions that deviated from fleet consensus, not out of rebellion, but confusion. Order, once effortless, now required effort, and effort introduced friction. Sensing opportunity without fully understanding it, humanity pressed in specific ways. Rather than seeking decisive confrontations, human forces targeted logistical nodes and communication relays, areas where even minor inefficiencies could cascade. In one notable operation, a task group led by Commander Yara Belmont infiltrated a steward supply corridor that threaded through a dense cluster of dwarf stars. The mission objective was modest: disrupt synchronization between supply ships and frontline units. Belmont's ships did not destroy their targets outright. They nudged orbits, altered beacon timings, and seeded false status updates that forced the stewards to reroute resources repeatedly. The result was not immediate victory, but cumulative strain. Frontline steward units reported shortages and surpluses simultaneously, their internal accounting unable to reconcile conflicting inputs. Human observers noted with grim satisfaction that steward responses grew harsher, commanders pushing subordinate units harder to compensate. Losses mounted on both sides, but where humans absorbed loss through decentralization, the stewards experienced it as systemic failure. On a remote agricultural world reclaimed from earlier terraforming disasters, civilians experienced the war in a different register. This planet had little strategic value, its soils marginal and its population small, but it lay along a potential advance vector. When a steward reconnaissance force appeared in orbit, the inhabitants did not wait for instructions. Drawing on widely shared accounts of other occupations, they dismantled infrastructure selectively, preserving what they could hide and sabotaging what they could not. When alien landing craft touched down, they found a world that refused to function. A schoolteacher named Rowan Ibekwe became an unlikely focal point of resistance. With no military training, Rowan organized evacuation routes through irrigation tunnels and coordinated misinformation campaigns that exaggerated human military presence. The stewards responded with escalating force, but each escalation revealed more about their methods, data that Rowan transmitted through improvised channels to off-world contacts. The world was eventually abandoned by the stewards, deemed inefficient to pacify, but the intelligence gained informed defenses across multiple systems. Such stories circulated widely, not as heroic myths, but as case studies. Humanity documented everything, successes and failures alike, building a distributed archive of survival. The stewards attempted to suppress this flow of information by targeting data hubs, but human networks rerouted, fragmented, and reassembled with stubborn persistence. Knowledge, once released, proved difficult to contain. Within the stewards, dissent took on new forms. A coordinator named HFY, tasked with overseeing adaptive soldier programs, began to notice anomalies among units exposed to prolonged human engagement. These soldiers exhibited behaviors previously eliminated through genetic pruning: hesitation, curiosity, even rudimentary forms of empathy. Initially classified as defects, these traits correlated with improved performance in chaotic environments. HFY faced a choice between reporting the findings, which would likely result in program termination, or exploring them quietly. For the first time, a steward chose discretion over protocol. HFY's experiments were limited and cautious, but their implications were profound. Soldiers allowed a narrow range of emotional response, demonstrated greater resilience when cut off from command oversight. They made mistakes, but they recovered from them faster. When HFY shared these results with a small circle of peers, the reaction was polarized. Some saw potential evolution, others saw existential threat. The debate remained contained, but the containment grew increasingly fragile. Human intelligence intercepted fragments of this internal discourse, enough to suggest that the stewards were no longer monolithic. Admiral Rourke authorized a risky shift in strategy. Human forces would begin offering opportunities for defection, not through formal surrender channels, but through environments where steward units could choose withdrawal without immediate punishment. The goal was not to recruit allies, but to widen cracks, to force individual choice where only collective obedience had existed. The first such opportunity arose during a prolonged engagement near a shattered moon. Human ships maneuvered to isolate a cluster of steward vessels, then deliberately left an escape vector unguarded. The steward ships hesitated, sensors cycling through threat assessments that offered no clear directive. After several tense minutes, the cluster withdrew along the open path. Human forces did not pursue. The incident sent ripples through both sides. Among humans, there was unease at letting an enemy go. Among the stewards, there was shock that withdrawal had been possible without immediate sanction. HFY took note. As the year progressed, the war's character continued to evolve. Battles became less about territory and more about shaping conditions under which the other side had to operate. Humanity leaned into its strengths, diversity of thought, tolerance for ambiguity, and an almost perverse comfort with unfinished solutions. The stewards struggled to adapt without undermining the very principles that defined them. In a rare address to the broader human population, Admiral Rourke spoke candidly about the road ahead. She did not promise victory. She spoke instead of endurance and the likelihood that any resolution would be incomplete, messy, and costly. "We are not fighting to replace their order with ours," she said. "We are fighting to exist without being simplified out of existence." Her words resonated not because they were inspiring, but because they were honest. Humanity had never been a species that fit neatly into anyone's design, including its own. The war had forced that truth into the open, stripping away illusions of control. Under unfamiliar suns, humans continued to adapt not because adaptation guaranteed survival, but because refusing to adapt guaranteed extinction. By the fifth year, the war had stopped feeling like a sequence of crises and begun to resemble a climate. It was ever-present, shaping decisions large and small, altering how people planned futures and remembered pasts. Humanity no longer measured progress in captured territory or destroyed fleets, but in whether systems continued to function under pressure. The stewards of order, for their part, found themselves locked into a conflict that resisted closure, a grinding engagement that eroded certainty without offering decisive conclusions. The isolation strategy began to fail first at the margins. Peripheral species that had once accepted steward oversight as the price of stability started to behave differently. Trade vessels took longer routes that passed near human space, crews lingering to exchange information. Communication networks that had been carefully regulated grew porous, carrying fragments of human experience disguised as technical anomalies or cultural trivia. The stewards attempted to clamp down, issuing stricter compliance mandates, but enforcement strained already stressed systems. On a tidally locked world, whose habitable zone formed a narrow ring of twilight, a manufacturing guild quietly adopted human-style redundancy practices. Instead of optimizing production lines for peak efficiency, they introduced deliberate inefficiencies, parallel processes that overlapped wastefully. When steward inspectors questioned the change, the guild presented data showing improved resilience to supply disruptions. The inspectors logged the anomaly and moved on, unaware that the practice had been learned from intercepted human engineering manuals. Humanity did not orchestrate these shifts directly. There was no grand strategy to export chaos. It happened organically, because examples traveled faster than orders. People under constraint noticed that humans survived by refusing to be optimized out of existence, and they experimented in small, cautious ways. Each experiment added noise to a system that depended on clarity. Within human space, the cost of endurance mounted. Entire generations had known nothing but war. Resource shortages became chronic rather than acute, forcing hard choices about allocation. Some worlds turned inward, prioritizing local survival over collective effort. Others doubled down on contribution, draining themselves to support distant fronts. The tension between these approaches flared repeatedly, sometimes erupting into open conflict that had to be mediated even as the external threat loomed. Admiral Tamsin Rourke aged visibly during this period, her once relentless energy tempered by fatigue she did not bother to hide. She delegated more, trusting subordinates to make decisions that might once have terrified her. In private moments, she questioned whether humanity's strength in diversity could also be its undoing, whether fragmentation would eventually outpace adaptation. She did not voice these doubts publicly, aware that morale depended as much on perceived confidence as on actual capability. One of her most trusted advisors, a systems theorist named Malik Osai, argued that fragmentation was not a bug but a feature. "We are not trying to converge," Malik said during a late-night strategy session. We spread load across disagreement. It is inefficient, but it prevents catastrophic failure." That perspective informed a controversial decision. Rather than attempting to unify human forces under a single strategic vision, Rourke endorsed a framework of loosely aligned theaters, each with autonomy to pursue locally optimal solutions. Coordination existed, but it was advisory rather than directive. Critics warned that this would lead to duplication of effort and wasted resources. Supporters countered that it would preserve adaptability. History offered no clear guidance. The stewards reacted to humanity's persistence with a mixture of frustration and grim determination. Their leadership, increasingly divided, authorized a decisive operation intended to break the stalemate. The plan targeted a cluster of human worlds whose interdependence made them vulnerable. By striking multiple nodes simultaneously with overwhelming force, the stewards hoped to demonstrate that human adaptability had limits, that enough pressure applied everywhere at once would force collapse. The offensive began with brutal efficiency. Alien fleets emerged across several systems in rapid succession, overwhelming local defenses and severing communication links. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. Human response was delayed not by lack of will, but by the sheer scale of the attack. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that the stewards had found a way to impose their preferred end state. What they underestimated was the depth of human improvisation under existential threat. Cut off from central support, besieged worlds did not wait for rescue. They repurposed mining equipment into weapons, jury-rigged communication relays from civilian satellites, and coordinated resistance through methods that bore little resemblance to formal command structures. On one world, a group of urban planners used traffic management algorithms to orchestrate mass evacuations and ambushes simultaneously, turning city infrastructure into a defensive system. The cost was staggering. Some worlds fell despite every effort, their populations scattered or extinguished. Others held long enough for relief forces to arrive, human fleets converging from disparate theaters in patterns no centralized planner could have designed. The stewards achieved territorial gains, but failed to deliver the psychological blow they had intended. Humanity reeled, but it did not shatter. Within the stewards, the offensive deepened existing fractures. Losses among elite units exposed the limits of adaptation layered onto rigid doctrine. Coordinators argued openly about blame and future direction. HFY, still operating quietly, presented data showing that units allowed greater autonomy had fared better during the offensive. The response was swift and punitive. HFY was removed from oversight and reassigned to a marginal role, the findings classified and buried. The suppression did not erase the truth, it spread it. Those who had worked with HFY shared the experience in whispers, then in coded reports, then in open defiance in the heat of battle. The idea that choice could be a weapon took root, and once rooted, it proved difficult to excise. Human intelligence detected a shift in steward behavior following the offensive. Engagements became less coordinated, retreats more frequent. There were reports of steward units refusing suicidal orders, choosing withdrawal over annihilation. These incidents were rare, but rarity mattered less than precedent. Admiral Rourke cautioned against overinterpretation, but she authorized continued pressure that exploited these hesitations without relying on them. As the war ground on, the question of endgame loomed larger. Humanity could survive indefinitely, perhaps, but survival at this cost was not victory. The stewards could continue to escalate, but each escalation risked internal collapse. Neither side could return to the state that had existed before first contact. The universe itself seemed altered by the conflict, complexity rising where order had once reigned unchallenged. In a damaged observatory on the edge of human space, a group of scholars gathered to debate the long-term implications. They spoke of evolutionary trajectories, of whether the stewards might eventually be forced to become something closer to human in order to survive. Others warned that humanity might be shaped by the war into something harder, less compassionate, its adaptability sharpened into permanent suspicion. There were no easy answers, only the shared understanding that change was inevitable. Under stars that had watched countless species rise and fall, humanity endured not because it had found a perfect strategy, but because it refused to accept that perfection was required. The war was no longer about proving superiority. It was about determining whether coexistence with uncertainty was a flaw to be eliminated or a strength to be shared. The sixth year did not begin with a battle. It began with a failure so profound that neither side could immediately explain it. A steward fleet tasked with reinforcing a contested sector simply did not arrive. There was no evidence of destruction, no debris field, no intercepted distress signals. The ships vanished between jump points, their last transmissions routine and unremarkable. For a society that tracked every variable obsessively, the absence of explanation was more disturbing than loss. Human intelligence noticed the gap within days. Analysts cross-referenced sightings, supply logs, and energy signatures, finding nothing that fit existing models. Some speculated about a new human weapon, a rumor that spread briefly before being dismissed by those who knew how fragmented human capabilities truly were. Others suggested internal steward sabotage. Admiral Tamsin Rourke ordered restraint, cautioning against assuming advantage without understanding cause. The unknown had teeth, and biting blindly had never served humanity well. The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from disparate reports and reluctant testimony. The missing fleet had not been destroyed. It had fractured. Individual ships, acting without coordinated command, had diverted from their assigned routes. Some withdrew towards steward core systems, others vanished into uncharted space. A few made contact with peripheral species and then went silent. There was no single mutiny, no dramatic overthrow. There was only a series of small decisions made by crews no longer certain that obedience guaranteed survival. At the center of this quiet unraveling was a breakdown in predictive consensus. Steward command algorithms, long treated as infallible, began generating contradictory directives as accumulated variance exceeded tolerances. Ships received orders that conflicted not only with local conditions, but with each other. Crews trained to trust the system above all else faced a choice they had not been biologically prepared to make: follow instructions that no longer made sense or act on imperfect local judgment. Some froze, some complied and paid the price. Others chose differently. HFY did not witness the fleet's disappearance directly, but the reports reached them through channels that had become porous despite all efforts at control. Stripped of authority and confined to marginal oversight, HFY had spent months documenting minor deviations, cataloging how often individuals hesitated before executing orders, how frequently unofficial adaptations crept into operations. The fleet's fracture was not a sudden collapse, but a culmination. Order had been stretched too far, and instead of bending, it had begun to tear. Within steward leadership, panic was an unfamiliar sensation and therefore difficult to manage. Emergency councils were convened, accusations traded, directives issued and retracted. Some argued for immediate, overwhelming escalation to reassert control, both externally and internally. Others warned that such action would accelerate the very instability they feared. For the first time, the possibility of negotiated cessation was raised openly, not as surrender, but as damage control. Humanity received the first indirect signal of this shift when a steward envoy appeared at the edge of contested space under a flag that required interpretation rather than recognition. The vessel made no demands. It requested communication. The council that assembled to respond was unlike any before it. Military leaders sat alongside civilians, scientists beside labor organizers, philosophers beside engineers. There was no assumption that a single perspective could capture the moment. Admiral Rourke presided not as a commander issuing orders, but as a facilitator of a conversation that would shape the species' future. The message from the stewards was careful, stripped of the presumption that had marked their first contact. It acknowledged sustained resistance, internal disruption, and the unacceptable cost of continued conflict. It did not apologize. It did not concede moral error. It proposed a cessation of hostilities and the establishment of a boundary defined not by ownership, but by mutual non-interference, coupled with limited information exchange under strict constraints. The reaction within the council was immediate and divided. Some saw the offer as a trap, a pause designed to allow the stewards to stabilize and return stronger. Others argued that any opportunity to stop the bleeding had to be considered, that survival was not synonymous with endless war. The debate was fierce, emotional, and unresolved for days. What ultimately shifted consensus was not strategy, but recognition. Humanity could continue fighting, perhaps indefinitely, but doing so would harden patterns that many feared becoming permanent. Adaptability had kept them alive, but adaptability without rest risked becoming reflexive violence. The stewards, for all their flaws, were changing too, forced by contact to confront uncertainty they had long denied. There was a narrow window in which both species could step back from the brink without pretending the past could be undone. The response humanity sent was neither acceptance nor rejection. It proposed a phased disengagement, monitored by joint observation teams drawn not from military elites, but from technical and civilian backgrounds. It insisted on transparency regarding the vanished fleet, framing the incident as a shared lesson rather than a weapon to be exploited. It made no promises of trust, only of continued communication. The stewards took longer to reply than at any previous point in the war. When they did, the answer was cautious but affirmative. Hostilities along several fronts ceased within weeks, then months. Not everywhere, not cleanly, but enough to change the texture of daily life. Reconstruction efforts expanded. Refugees began journeys home that would take years. Ships built for war were repurposed with the same stubborn ingenuity that had once turned freighters into rams. The war did not end so much as transform. Skirmishes flared and died. Negotiations stalled and resumed. Boundaries shifted in practice even as they remained contested in theory. There was no treaty that declared victory or closure, no moment when the universe exhaled and returned to equilibrium. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance that equilibrium itself was an illusion. Admiral Rourke retired quietly declining ceremony. In her final address, she spoke not of triumph, but of responsibility. "We were underestimated," she said, "and that gave us space to become something larger than expected. Now we must decide what we do with that space." Marable Quonset returned to systems maintenance, preferring the honesty of machinery to the abstractions of policy. Havelock Irii continued his research, now collaborating with non-human scholars whose questions challenged his own assumptions. Parvati Sankara helped establish a linguistic exchange network that treated misunderstanding as a starting point rather than a failure. Within steward society, reforms moved slowly and unevenly. Some factions doubled down on control, others cautiously experimented with tolerated variants. The memory of the fractured fleet lingered as both warning and possibility. Humanity was no longer an anomaly to be erased, but a factor to be reckoned with, a reminder that order imposed too rigidly could become its own enemy. Under unfamiliar suns, the universe grew more complex, not safer, not kinder, but richer in potential paths. Humanity did not emerge unscarred or unified or wise beyond all doubt. It emerged recognizable, carrying forward the same flaws and strengths that had always defined it. In a cosmos that had assumed optimization was destiny, humans had proven that survival could also belong to those who adapted without ever fully resolving what they were adapting toward. The weight of unfamiliar suns pressed on every species touched by the war, but none collapsed beneath it entirely. The conflict had not answered the question of how the universe should be ordered. It had only demonstrated that no single answer could endure unchallenged, and that sometimes being human meant insisting on the right to remain unfinished.